Welcome to Snooze with Sam. Scottish sleep stories, mindfulness and meditations, and other stuff including this. Here we've got another wee raw one. This is going to be as it comes, by the way. It's just me and the woodpeckers, as I'm sure you can hear. Well, you join me down in the Seven Staines Forestry Park in southern Dumfries, or Dumfriesshire I should say. What a stunning bit of woodland this is. It's one of those expansive places that goes on and on and on. Doesn't matter which direction you take. There's just endless paths and trails. I mean, I've kind of come off the beaten track, just because although it's a woodland and we're still in the middle of nowhere, we're not alone. So as much as I'm sure all of you would love a little visit from a little doggo, there's going to be no catos here, but definitely doggos. We found a little peace and quiet. So it's just you, me, and the birds. And yes, this is me. I'm wiggling my toes. It is just... We just found a wee spot to relax and sit down. What I'll do is probably make the screen dark for you after about five minutes or so, just so you can avoid having any unnecessary light in your room. Not that you're in your room, because you're here with me in this lovely woodland. Over to our right, the sun's kind of halfway up and down in the sky. It's about 12:30, around about midday. And it is a beautiful day. I reckon this is the warmest day so far this year in Scotland. It's proper taps off weather. Stunning. So we're slightly sheltered from some of the trees, but broken sunlight drenching us where we sit just now. Lots of space in between the trees, as you can see, but just allowing the sun to soak the woodland floor. You can see lots of little grass shoots beginning to come up, and over behind us there's swathes of wild garlic. It's completely coating the floor of coating the ground. That'll be rife for salads in the next few weeks, no doubt. Over to our right, there is a little stream, but we're not too close to it or too far away. Hopefully just enough to provide a little white noise for us, which is so nice. And then, of course, there's the billions of little birds, providing us with a constant, soothing, musical lullaby. What would we do without garden birds, eh? Anyway, like you know, these raw ones will come with all the rougher edges, so the skies have been very busy today. Not just with birds, but with planes and helicopters, and you'd swear we were next to Heathrow Airport or JFK. We'll survive, I think. Anyway, today I've got a little book with me all about Scotland BC, before Christ. And there's a couple of pieces inside it that I think I'd love to share with you. Namely, brochs. It's an area of historical architecture that my sister knows a lot about. And realistically I should have asked her to educate me, but I don't know nothing, far from it, but I've not visited nearly as many brochs as she has. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a broch is, hello Mr. Woodpecker, or Mrs. Brochs are kind of strongly fortified residences. They were mainly for chiefs and wealthy landowners, basically miniature castles. They tend to be standing on their own, one to any area of land, still with a position of vantage, so like where a castle might be positioned, there could well just be a broch instead, because ultimately they are smaller. They were probably cheaper to make, obviously, but still provided a solid defence and a residency that would stand the test of time, which is exactly what has happened. Because there's so many still around today in Scotland. I don't know exactly how many there are, but we may learn over the foreseeable ones. So, yeah. So when you're ready, if you're not comfy already, just lie yourself back. Take a nice deep breath. Let the sounds of the birds just wiggle their way inside your ears. And let's enjoy some nice light education on brochs. So twice in its history, Scotland's response to troubled times has been to build strongly fortified residences for chiefs and wealthy landowners. It was as if I'd just glanced over that sentence but a few minutes ago. The medieval response gave us tower houses. The Iron Age response gave us brochs. Here we go. Some 500 brochs have survived, mostly in the north and the west, and they are a uniquely Scottish phenomenon. Granted, many are now little more than mounds of tumbled stone, which is it is the reality for quite a few that I've seen. You might get maybe a semicircle, or a half of what was originally there, still preserved and standing, but quite often it's just very, very old and weathered stones, like a crumbling castle, funny enough. So yes, many are now little more than mounds of tumbled stone, but some are still awesome memorials to the determination of their builders. As an architectural fashion, they were relatively short-lived. They seem to have developed by about 100 BC out of a combination of traditions of thick, walled roundhouses and small stone-built forts. And the need for them seems to have passed by about 100 AD. So maybe only a lifespan of 200 years, architecturally at least. These days that would be a very long time. In fact, it's almost like any style of building, if we think of the Victorian or Georgian architectural building quality, that's already been outdated, so short for then, I suppose. Anyway, although of course many continued in use for a century or more thereafter 100 AD. Essentially the broch, and that comes from the Old Norse term borg, meaning fort. Essentially the broch is a massively built roundhouse grown tall. Not all were as tall as the most famous brochs on the Shetland island of Musa, and those are still heavily preserved, if you can call it that, very well preserved. That's still about 13 metres high, which is, how many stories is that? 5 or 6 stories? 4 or 5 maybe. But they were all circular towers with no windows, and normally a single entrance, built with walls exceedingly thick at the base and tapering as they rose. That's definitely one of the main takeaways I've had from some that I've seen. You think castle walls can be thick, you know, think meters thick, which is just a phenomenal high quality use of resources. I mean, obviously they were built to last forever. Like, that was how things were done of an age. Certainly not anymore, is it? But yeah, it was. I remember when I was small, there's actually a photograph of me, I think. That's probably not a broch, but it's a similarly aged stone building. Photograph of me standing or sitting. Can you tell my memory of this photo is equally as vague as the story I'm telling? But yes, there was a photo of me, probably about 5 or 6 years old, I think, standing on top of a ruin of a broch, and the whole thing just envelops me because it's so damn thick. Think of it, if you've ever been to Hadrian's Wall, and I did mention that in a previous story actually. Hadrian's Wall is so impressive still because of at least the surviving portions of it are definitely deeper than they are tall, and it was a tall wall once upon a time, but maybe 1.8 to 2 metres deep, you know, a good 6 or 7 feet. Incredible. And the brochs are quite often the same. Anyway, in the far north, the wall base is commonly solid stonework, but elsewhere it contains cells and galleries. Common to all brochs is the characteristic hollow wall construction of the upper part of the tower. For this reduced the weight of the dry stone masonry and thus allowed greater height to be achieved safely. Horizontal slabs across the hollow wall core bonded the inner and outer faces together and allowed a stairway to be created within the wall, leading up to a lookout gallery at the top of the broch. Again, those that I have managed to climb before, because there have been a few that were perfectly preserved basically. The stairways tend to kind of represent an equally narrow corridor that you might get in some castle turrets. If you've ever been in a winding staircase of especially the upper reaches of a castle, you won't need to tell me how claustrophobic it can seem. I know people are taller these days, and I am, I'm up there. I'm about 6'2" or so. Not huge, but certainly not small, and with broader shoulders. And the number of times I've got, could have easily got stuck in some of these stairways or archways in castles is I've not got enough fingers, to be honest. It's made for some very entertaining moments over life. But you can definitely tell that people were of a slightly more diminutive stature a few thousand years ago. They obviously weren't eating all their greens, doing as their mother was telling them to finish their veg. Eat your broccoli. I digress. As per... Aye. The cells and the galleries were probably used for storage. Apart from the guard cells, sometimes opening off the entrance passage behind the door. Behind the door. This is a strangely written piece. The ground floor of the broch acted as a living room, furnished with slab-built hearths and storage tanks, water cisterns or wells, and sleeping accommodation was on a timber gallery lining the upper part of the broch. Very similar to castle construction again. This is usually, as the heat rises in all these buildings where insulation was effectively non-existent, i.e. the stone walls were the insulation, just the sheer thickness of them. But they relied on the heat travelling up through the floorboards, basically, because obviously there would be gaps or small gaps in between them. So to situate the bedrooms high up where they could absorb much of that heat from the lower floors was perfectly commonsensical. That's obvious, I guess. They weren't so daft. These have long since rotted away. We're still talking about the brochs on Shetland Islands, by the way. I've not made that very clear. These are Shetland brochs on the island of Musa. So yes, these have long since rotted away. But excavation has revealed post holes in the floors of several brochs. And the best example of those is probably Duntrodden in Glenelg, where a complete ring of post holes was found. And Glenelg, just because it's been mentioned, Glenelg is a beautiful little village in a quite an isolated part of the very western Highlands, very near to the Isle of Skye. That's the reason of mentioning it, is just because it's so close to where I grew up. But Glenelg these days is famous for its tiny little ferry crossing across the Sound of Slate. Well, not quite the Sound of Slate, but it's nearly there. And the crossing takes only a few minutes. But apart from being famous just for its short length, the current flowing between the mainland and the Isle of Skye is so strong with the tide, because the crossing is so narrow. The fluid dynamics of the Sound just create this relentless to and fro speeding waterway, which is quite something to witness, by the way, because you'd swear it was being pushed along by force. But so this small ferry is constantly sailing in a nearly a 45-degree angle to the direction which it's actually aiming to go, purely to try and battle the current. If you ever get the chance to visit Skye or Glenelg, do make sure to make that crossing, because it's quite something. And the town of Glenelg itself, it's a hamlet. It's a very quaint little place, and if you're to drive there and not take the ferry, you're a good half an hour to 40 minutes of small winding roads, and they're extremely steep. So if you want to feel remote, that's definitely a place to aim for. It's just nice that it mentioned Glenelg. I'm sure I'll come to it again in a moment. Anyway, where were we? Yes, so the excavation. There is often a narrow ledge, or scarcement, running round the inner face of the broch wall at a height of between 1.5 and 3.3 metres, and this suggests that it supports the horizontal beams of the gallery. Yes, it would suggest so, wouldn't it? The two tallest surviving brochs, that is Musa and Duntelv, the latter also in Glenelg, close by to Duntrodden, they have a second ledge higher up which probably supported the roof of the gallery. The broch itself is unlikely to have been roofed, so as to allow light into the interior. Like their medieval counterparts, most brochs survive today as gaunt and isolated shells, but also like tower houses. Most had an outer enclosure, or barmkin, whatever that word means. I've not come across it before. Must be like an outer enclosure. So yes, most had an outer enclosure, or barmkin, within which lesser domestic buildings might huddle. Compare the broch at Yarshof in Shetland, with its high-walled courtyard, with the tower house at Smailholm in the Borders, with its barmkin. Many of the broch sites in the far north developed into fortified villages, each dominated by its tower, and the village sometimes outlived the broch. Vast quantities of artefacts and animal bones have been recovered from excavations of brochs and their associated buildings. Although, unfortunately, it is now often impossible to know exactly where they were found on the site, because so many brochs were cleared out in the last century. The situation is rather better with the collections from Gurness and Midho, both in Orkney, excavated this century, and current work on the finds from a recently excavated broch site at Howe, near Stromness in Orkney, will improve our understanding even more. Gurness alone yielded more than 850 artefacts and a vast quantity of broken pottery. Overall, the impression is given of an economy based on mixed farming and fishing, local production of pottery, tools and clothing, and a taste for exotic imports from the south of Scotland, acquired presumably by honest barter as loot from raids or as gifts. It's probably much more likely to be loot from raids. An honest barter in Scotland usually results in somebody calling the other person something rude and giving them a wee Glasgow kiss. I wish I was exaggerating, but I guess it depends on who's doing the bartering and where they're from. No prejudices here. Exotic imports from the south of Scotland. You'd think it would be bananas from Jamaica getting imported here, but no, it's probably just a different flavour of potato taken from the lowlands up to Fort William. Different braids of tatty. Anyway, the latter include items of Roman origin, such as the red Samian pottery, sorry if I butchered that, and bronze ladle from Midhow, and the fragments of glass bowl found at Clickaman, which is thought to have been made in Alexandria, in Egypt, around 100 AD. Now we're talking. That's a real exotic import. Discoveries of clay crucibles and moulds, as well as slag, are evidence of the activities of bronzesmiths and blacksmiths. By the way, I'm nearly certain slag is it's just a name for a certain fragmentation of rock used. I can't remember the specifics, but it's nothing rude. So yes, manufacturing bronze jewellery and fittings for weapons, such as knobs for the base of spear shafts, a mould for which came from Gurness, and iron tools. Notable among a wide variety of bone and stone tools are spinning and weaving equipment, querns and grinders for processing grain, stone lamps, and, in a lighter vein, bone gaming dice. Well, at least we know they had a bit of fun, played snakes and ladders, or gambled their savings away. That woodpecker is the sign for me to take a very short little break. So I'm going to stand up, stretch off a little, go and rustle some leaves, and I will be right back with you. And we are back. It was a lovely wee stroll, actually. I did go for a wee walk, and as at the beginning, a wee pair of woodpeckers were squabbling and flying between trees and all seemingly fighting over the same branch. At least that's what it looks like, but could well just be some courting ritual. It is that time of year after all, where all the pigeons are at it and all loved up. Just lovely to see. All of nature preparing to be mothers and fathers again. I always love seeing them because they are still what you would call a rare bird, I guess, in the UK, but you just have to be in the right place, like many things. They're only rare because you aren't where they usually are, but spend a fair bit of time in a place where a certain element of wildlife is known to be present, then yeah, sure, you'd say they were common as muck. But they're still so exotic and beautiful. And I love watching them flap. It's always flurries of wing beats, and then they just soar in this huge, great arcing line. And then only at the very last minute, when they start to just properly fall, do they begin to beat their wings again, and away they go. Stunning wee things. Bless them and their wee beaks and their wee eggs. Okay, I'd like to read you a little piece about Gurness, which is on Orkney. I've been there once, I believe. I might have been there twice, but Orkney is so rich with ancient architecture that it's difficult to keep track sometimes. And it was quite a while since I last did a proper tour of Orkney. Maybe 2014, which was a darn long time ago. It was probably one of the first times I went, actually. I guess that's the likely reason I did do a tour of Orkney. I took my motorbike up to see my friend who does still live there, and he also had motorbikes, so we spent 2 days riding around all the islands and seeing the sights and sounds. I guess it was like a welcome to Orkney. Let's go and experience a bit of what makes this place awesome. And that's precisely what we did, and I believe we did go to the Gurness brochs. Like many places up there, it is a gorgeous, wild feeling location. It's not difficult when you are in the outer reaches of the British Islands, or Hebrides if you want to call them that. I suppose they are their own region up there. You wouldn't call them Hebrides, but it's a very close place to my heart, Orkney. Must have been 6 or 7 times. It's a real treat to go up. I always think if you were from somewhere south in the UK, for example, people in London see the Midlands and Manchester, Birmingham area as far north, and then those people think that Newcastle and Carlisle are really far north and that London's far south, and then those in Carlisle and Newcastle think that Scotland in general is really far north now, and then where we are Dumfries and the Glasgow and Edinburgh areas, even to them, and we'll say us, even to them, the islands and the west coast and Shetland and Orkney is just a total different world away. So there's so many stages of feeling lost in the wild as you crawl up the country, because it's quite a long way from north to south. Not in terms of American states or Australian outback, it's not that big obviously, but because everything changes so quickly in the UK, scenery wise, feel wise, nature wise, you get the sensation that you're covering quite a lot of ground. when you do travel north especially. So I love to imagine it, if you were from London, just thinking that Orkney must be a different universe altogether, because it pretty much is. Right above our heads, by the way, on a tree that's maybe maybe 10 metres away, there is a woodpecker, and he's pecking furiously at the moss about 2/3 of the way up. Could be a she as well, apologies. And just hearing clatters of debris falling from the treetops and just hitting the leaves down below every few minutes. Probably just searching for little insects or preparing the surface to give it a good pecking. It's so funny, like, they must be a bit more used to people here, because if it obviously knows I'm here, we are here, but if it was anywhere else, it would probably have flown away, so it must be very comfortable. Anywho, where were we? Gurness. Until 1930, the broch of Gurness was hidden beneath a vast grassy mound. But a decade of excavation and consolidation revealed not only a broch and its encircling defences, but also a unique complex of domestic buildings dating from broch times and on into the historical Pictish era. Now the Picts are a group, or an era, I suppose, as they've said, that I am going to be exploring very soon, by the way, so be prepared for a historical story investigating them and their times. The northern part of the site has suffered from coastal erosion, but it seems likely that originally the outer defences encircled the broch entirely. The main element is a rock-cut ditch, about 4 metres wide and up to 2 metres deep. Its sides faced with dry stone walling, and it is accompanied by 2 outer ramparts. An entrance on the east side lines up with the entrance onto the broch, and the pathway between the two was honoured by the buildings that grew up around the broch tower and remains an impressively ordered site even today. It mentions coastal erosion there. It's a known factor all around the world, obviously, but so many of the UK's fortifications, the UK is famous for its castles, stately homes, and so on, but so many of the fortifications are still being affected by the increased rate of coastal erosion as well, by altering sea levels and just the abrasive weather that we can get. And it's quite alarming just how quickly the coast can recede over time. Now, this broch in particular and the site, I didn't really appreciate it too much at the time, purely because of how well ordered it was. Like, the grounds were levelled properly, and it's obvious that it's been built to stay protected. But from an aerial view photo here, the coast really is eating away at this site. So they were still doing some of this when I went. But yeah, it's still a shame that it's just so susceptible to time, I suppose. There's nothing really that, well, there's not a whole great deal that humans can do to completely remove factors such as natural erosion. There's still so much of it there though. So I really recommend everyone goes, especially while it's still there. The broch has survived to a maximum height of only about 3.5 metres, owing to stone robbing and collapse. But in a sense, its denuded state is a measure of the success of its location, for the site was inhabited on and off for some 900 years, and later builders used the old tower as a convenient quarry. The thick wall base has a gallery running through it, and the interior of the broch, about 10 metres in diameter, is crowded with slab-built cubicles, staircases, hearths, and a remarkable well 4 metres in depth. Some of these furnishings, including the well, are original, and others are later additions. Gurness is most famous, however, for the village of terraced houses that surrounds the broch. They are somewhat irregular in shape, and mostly so large that it is unlikely that they were wholly roofed. Better perhaps to think of them as walled yards, in which there were likely smaller roofed buildings within. This probably lent well to lending the space kind of out of doors for working and playing and so on. They were family homes after all. There are hearths and doorways and slab-lined tanks, and the whole impression is of a busy and flourishing close-knit community. Here, better than anywhere, it is possible to appreciate the endless variations on what can be achieved with large, thin slabs of Orkney flagstones. The dating evidence available is not overly precise, but an acceptable sequence seems to be that the broch and its outer defences were built in the 1st century AD, if not even earlier. And that the village developed subsequently, that's the outer walls of the houses, kind of encroached upon like the great ditch just where it hits the broch. The broch and the village together thrived for potentially 3 or 4 centuries. There was then a gap of 2 centuries or so, during which Gurness lay apparently abandoned. Oh, those woodpeckers are something else. Oh, I love them. So yes, there was a gap where the village was apparently abandoned, and the broch and the houses filled with debris, to the extent that the new inhabitants around 600 AD were able to level the ruins and build their own, quite different houses on top of the old. All later buildings had to be removed in the course of excavation in order to expose the original village. But one of these Pictish houses has been rebuilt in front of the museum. It consists of a series of small oval rooms built round a central hearth. Part of an oblong house has also been rebuilt. Its date is uncertain, but it may be a Viking Age longhouse. There was certainly Viking Age activity on the site, because a 9th century grave and a number of contemporary stray objects have been found, all pointing to their presence. Gurness is one of 8 brochs lining the shores of Einhollow Sound, 4 on mainland and 4 on Rousay. And the importance of the area seems to have continued into Pictish times, because a marvellous treasure of silver and amber, now lost by the way, which is a shame, was found buried in the ruins of one of the other brochs. So now if we go down to the other end of Scotland, down in the borders, which is potentially, how far are we from there now? From Duns, maybe 80 miles east of where we currently are. There is a place called Eden's Hall. Now Eden's Hall, near Duns in Berwickshire, might be seen as the lowland equivalent of Gurness. This is an impressive site about which tantalisingly little is known, apart from the basic sequence of its components: fort, broch, and settlement of stone-built houses, all of which can be seen on the ground, or perhaps even more clearly from the air. And yes, here there is an aerial photograph showing the remains of the broch circle. It's the most visible portion, but then also a series of other following ringlets, all very likely stone walls in their own right, still pointing towards it being a walled village of sorts. The broch and some of the houses were dug on several occasions in the 19th century, but few finds and very little information resulted. Major problems arise from the lack of dating evidence. For instance, what was the relationship between the fort and its neighbour on Coburn Law? A classic hilltop fort caps the law, high above Eden's Hall, lying on its lowest slope. And it is difficult to envisage the two as contemporary. If Eden's Hall fort was built late in the first millennium BC, it may not be much older than the broch. The fort was built on the edge of the steep slope that drops away to the White Adder water below, so that one side of the fort at least has some natural defence. Elsewhere, there are two ramparts and ditches, with an entrance on the east. Confusingly, there are several other breaks across the defences, but these are not original. The broch was built in one corner of the fort, and it appears to have its own small walled enclosure around it. This arrangement is reminiscent of forts in southern England, where an unusually large house may be set apart within its own enclosure, and where the clear implication of that is that of special status. It is possible that at Eden's Hall, the broch represents the chief's house rebuilt in a new and somewhat alien fashion. Not surprisingly, the broch is unusual compared with northern examples. It must be because it's from exotic parts in the south of Scotland. With an internal diameter of almost 17 metres, with a wall 5 to 6 metres thick. It is very large for a broch, but it does possess a number of classic broch features, including mural cells. In its restored state, the wall is almost 2 metres high, and while it may originally have been twice that height, it seems unlikely that it was ever a tall tower. Certainly not with walls that thick. The thing would have weighed a ton. It would have taken a very long time to make. Nevertheless, it was still sufficiently impressive in the late medieval times to have earned the name Odin's Hall. The entrance passage, almost 5 meters long, is checked about halfway along for a door, behind which there is a large guard cell on either side. 3 even larger cells within the wall can be entered from the courtyard, one with a stairway leading upwards. Apart from the broch, a number of circular buildings and walls fills the rest of the fort interior, some overlying the old defences. A passageway through these later buildings leads from the fort entrance towards the gateway into the broch enclosure, suggesting, as is the same at Gurness, that the broch was still in use during the development of this village. Internally, one of the houses is almost as large as the broch itself, and twice the size of the rest of the village, again hinting at a special social and functional status. Well, everyone, as the sun lowers in the sky, the air cools slightly, and the day moves on, I will wish you all a very good night, as will all the little birds and the woodpeckers. Let your mind go blank. Just, even though we've stopped reading, just allow the same environment just to soothe you into a lovely sleep tonight. It's truly beautiful, and I know, at least in spirit, that you are all here with me. So from nature and Dumfries's woodlands, and from myself, good night, everyone.